Hello, welcome to Movers, Shakers, Designers, Makers. I'm Steve Carpenter. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Architecture at Penn State. And today I'm talking with Dr. Deborah Confredo, who earned her Master of Education degree at Penn State in music education in 1988. In spring of 2020, Dr. Confredo was selected by the School of Music to be the recipient of an Arts and Architecture Alumni Award. However, due to COVID, we made the decision to postpone the campus visit until the fall, when we hope to have Deb here to receive this award in person and to meet our students and our faculty. In the meantime, you just have to get to know her this way through our Movers, Shakers, Designers, Makers interview. Deb, welcome. It's so good to meet you.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to meet you too. And thanks for that nice introduction. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. So Deb, listen, I noticed right away as we were prepping for this interview that we were in different programs here in the College of Arts and Architecture as graduate students. The two of us both pursuing master degrees at about the same time. I like to say back in the 1900s.
Steve, don't make us seem any older than we are, okay? But that's crazy that we were there at the same time. That's great.
It's the late 1900s. How's that? So it's not quite as far away.
Feels better. Yeah.
The other piece is we share a commonality of our undergraduate degrees. I studied at Slippery Rock University, and you were at Mansfield, as far as I understand.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So small state universities, and then we come to this large Research One institution. Who helped you make that decision that this was a good idea to move from a smaller campus and university environment to a larger research institution?
That's a great question. And so I'll rewind the clock even further back to when I was in high school. And I knew early on when I was in junior high that I wanted to be a music educator when I grew up. And I was the first one in our family actually to get a degree in higher education, and the first of 4 children. And our family wasn't very affluent. My dad is a blue collar worker, and Mom and Dad decided that they could only provide 2 years of assistance for all the children, and then we would be on our own. And I was looking at all kinds of places, and for the money and for the experience, Mansfield seemed like a perfect fit. In addition to that, not having parents who went to college, my parents are great and they're probably the smartest people I know, but they didn't have that opportunity, and they weren't able to direct me in one way or another. So I kind of was on my own when it came to figuring out where I wanted to go. So I checked out a number of state schools, and anyway, long story short, I ended up at Mansfield, which was great because Mansfield, as you know, having gone to Slippery Rock, a relatively small university, but the music department was really pretty robust. So I ended up flourishing there. I was able to be in a lot of ensembles and got really good instruction, and came out feeling very prepared to be a music educator. So it was perfect for me at that time. Then, I was teaching. I started teaching in the southern tier of New York before coming back down to Pennsylvania. And as you know, as soon as you start teaching in Pennsylvania, the clock starts to tick on your provisional certificate. And I needed to start thinking about what I was going to do. And truth be told, I was a little disillusioned with music ed around my 4th year of teaching, which isn't too unusual. If you look at the data of if we lose people in our profession, it's within those first 5 years. So I was starting to feel like I'm not so sure about this for any number of reasons. And I was hot for numbers. I was thinking actually about going into actuarial science, which would have been cool because I like doing that kind of thing. But I decided that, I needed to take one step into the higher ed world again, and if for nothing else than to start chipping away at what I needed to do to get my permanent certificate in Pennsylvania. So I was teaching in Harrisburg at the time, and the drive from Harrisburg to Penn State was not a not a huge drive. So I ended up taking one class in the, I want to say it was in the summertime. And then the following fall, I ended up taking a couple classes at night. So I was teaching full time and then making the drive a couple times a week. And what I can tell you is, my experience was great. I had really wonderful colleagues in all the classes I took as a part-timer. I wasn't even I hadn't even applied for the degree program yet. I was sort of a non-matric status. And Keith Thompson was at Penn State at the time, and I had a couple classes with Keith, and I remember him giving back a paper that I had written, and he wrote a handwritten note on it saying, and it was a researchy kind of thing, and he said, you really should do more of this. You're really good at this. And I was just a band director. I didn't know from writing or research or whatever. And I ended up talking with Keith, and I wanted to know more about why he thought that. And we talked, and he was very encouraging to me. You need to think about this. I know you like teaching in public school. Please consider this. And so it was a really wonderful conversation. And after my 6th year of teaching, I ended up at Penn State full time. Now, the irony of that was that was also the time when Keith left to go to the University of Illinois. So I came, and he was like, "See ya," and it was an opportunity for him, I guess, to just get a different perspective. And but it ended up being an opportunity for me too, because I had, because of my part-time status, I had opportunity to get to know Joanne Rakowski a little bit. And coming in as a master's student, I had been given an assistantship, and because of the timing when Keith left, there was a bit of a short staffing situation, and Joanne gave me the opportunity to do some university teaching right out of the chute. Now, I was really green, but Joanne had far more faith in me than I did. And I remember talking to her, and she said, it's just like doing what you're doing now. The population is different. The content is still music, and I'm going to help you out. And she did. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's how I got from a school of 2,000 to a school that's far greater in size than 2,000.
Exactly. I appreciate that that response for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is sometimes it's the very seemingly small incidental comments, right, to the recipient. Oh, that just seems like a toss away comment. They're really meaningful and impactful. You should do more of this. Right. My gosh, that's a phrase you have remembered, and it's a phrase that propelled you to ask, well, what did you mean? And it started this process. So the other piece connected there is both Keith and Joanne, they saw something in you that you didn't see, right? But you had faith in in their vision. You had faith in how they saw you. I'm sure you probably have done something similar to your own students.
You're reading my mind, and as you were saying that, Steve, so there were two outcomes of that experience from both Keith and Joanne. Mm-hmm. The most immediate outcome was for me in terms of a career shift, right? But I shouldn't say but, and it was a teaching moment for them to me, in exactly what you're talking about. It's something that I carried with me, for decades now. Mm-hmm. And, I'll give you an example. One of my doctoral students right now he just finished his first year, and he's kind of guy where, he comes in, and at first blush, you would think he's a very confident person. But then once you get to know him, he's not very confident at all. I shouldn't say that. He's got some things that some insecurities, I guess I should say. So I had him in a research class, and he was poking around in some of the literature, and he came upon some work in music education that had to do with imposter syndrome. And they had to come up with a possible project in my class. And so we talked about that. And I knew this was one of those, I see this in myself moments in him, and I want to find out more about it. Right. And so by digging into issues of the imposter syndrome, which he's doing right now, actually, she's taken that project and he's kind of run with it, which I think is great. It sort of gives a label for what we all see, in our students, that there are some people who just need a little bit of a push, or a kind word, or just somebody to recognize something in them that they might be reticent to recognize in themselves. For years I taught instrumental methods, how to teach people how to be band and orchestra directors. And one of the things that, I would say to them, and I do with my graduate students from time to time as well, is that, it's easy for us, particularly when you're on the podium, to hear mistakes and act as the plumbers of the world. When do you need a plumber? Well, two times, right? When you're building a house, right, and when you're trying to plug a leak, right?
Right.
And plumbers are important people, and we need them. But if you serve as the person who's trying to plug leaks, find leaks and plug leaks, figuratively speaking, on the podium, that's not very proactive, right? And it reinforces a sort of a negative approach rather than a positive, proactive approach on the podium. And so the things that you identified in what I found from Keith and Joanne has penetrated all of my teaching. And I'm not as good at it as I want to be, but it's there. And to be able to say to a student, you should think about this, or that was as a great comment, tell me more about that, I think has functioned really well for some students. And if that can be a teaching moment from me to somebody else that I experience as a student, well, then good. It's that circle of educational life, I think.
Absolutely.
One of the mantras that I use for myself, that I share with my students, is if I go to bed at night and I cannot say that I learned something today, then I haven't been paying attention.
Wow.
And a lot of that comes from our students. And if we were at Penn State at the same time together, that's, it's been a while, right? And it's funny in that the freshmen keep coming in and they're always going to be 18, but I keep getting older, right? So I need to do, I shouldn't say I, because it's all of us, we need to continue to evaluate ourselves, shake up our classes, continue to read, be relevant and up to date. Why? Because that's what our students require. If I thought I was a pretty good teacher back in the 80s, but if I taught today the way I taught then, it wouldn't be good for anybody.
But let's talk about that a bit. We're sitting here in mid-June of 2021. We are, for anyone who is hopeful, emerging from this global pandemic. And so as an academic administrator, I'm always thinking about, or I'm curious about, we're engaging in conversations with other folks about how they navigated the year. I know how I did it. I know how we did it together here, staff, faculty, students. Can you give me a little more insight into how you navigate? And I love how you kind of led it, we didn't kind of script this necessarily, but led up to, had I been teaching like I used to teach now, something might not have worked for most people in that project.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. This has been this has been a year of awakening for lots of people, and this as well as anyone, given your position and your background. Arts educators truly identify ourselves through our medium. I mean, we really do. And in music, I'll pick on the band folks because I'm one of them. We tend to think of ourselves as the band director, right? Rather than a music educator. Now that's not everybody, but that's, that's top of mind for lots of folks. When that goes away, when that it becomes impossible to work the way we have traditionally, then what? And I'm comforted. I mean, it is a tough year. It's a tough year, and that's really an understatement. But I'm comforted by the fact that we, as a profession, demonstrated such resilience. Um, People were not going to be shut down or silenced. Our, my students who are teaching now, my colleagues with whom I teach, we weren't to be silenced, and we were going to figure it out. For what? For our students. And again, this better than anybody. We are in a service profession. This isn't for us. We do this for everyone for whom we serve. Everyone we serve. And so we had to figure it out for our kids. How did things change for me? Well, it's an interesting question. Prior to now, that I'm not physically in Philadelphia any longer. I'm down here in Louisiana, and about, I want to say 6 years ago now, maybe a little longer, we went to the dean and said, hey, we've got this sort of wild hair that we want to develop an online master's degree in music ed. Would you support that? And he did. And when I say support that, I don't mean just lip service. He connected us with the Fox School of Business. The Fox School has an online MBA. They knew how to do this, right? So they helped us with the organization. They helped us with crafting we use Canvas, the Canvas sites. They helped us with the video vault, right? So there's hundreds of videos that we've crafted over the past several years. After the program was up and running, and starting to see really nice results, we started getting people from all over Pennsylvania and outside of Pennsylvania. And now it's very robust. Then I went to my dean and I said, here's what I'd like to do. and this was not why I put the online program together, but it just so happened that my husband had retired and we were thinking about moving to Louisiana. And I said, rather than just retiring, I said, I'd like to move to Louisiana and teach online. And he said, okay. So now what did that mean? It meant that I had to give up my two bands, which is, was sorrowful for me, but it was time. Yeah. And so we moved to Louisiana, and on fall of 2019, I was on sabbatical. So I started teaching online here right before the pandemic hit.
I see.
And so what happened then was, as the pandemic was just wreaking havoc on university instruction, the university reached out to those of us across campus whose experiences in online teaching was far greater than others, and they asked us to help our colleagues. Mm-hmm. And so we did. We set up Zoom meetings for people who, well, for example, and my heart went out to our studio faculty, who are used to working one-on-one with people, sitting together at a piano, or a clarinet player sitting next to their instructor, those kinds of things. Those folks had it very difficult, I think, because, as you know, music being played across Zoom doesn't work very well. There's a latency issue that's, I don't know when that's going to be fixed. I don't know, but so live music making was difficult. And the other thing too is, I worked with a few faculty who were, I'm 62, and I feel I'm fairly competent with technology, but I have a lot of colleagues who are a lot older than I who aren't. And those are folks who had real difficulty. So we dropped everything, helped those folks to get up and running so that we could make that turnaround in a very short amount of time. Anyway, so, and there were some balls dropped along the way, but that was the same all across the country, as you know. But fewer balls were dropped than were kept in the air, and I think that that's really a testimony to, you know, like I said, the resilience of the faculty and the desire to help their students to continue to be successful. So my job, you know, getting back to your question, my job didn't really change that much because I was already, you know, doing things full time online. But how it did change was in giving service to my colleagues to help everybody to be on, you know, to be successful. You know.
Sure. And that's just inherently who you are. You're an educator, right?
Yeah. Right.
And it's just it translates across disciplines because it's about that interaction, that mutual engagement.
Right.
So still in the COVID space, I want to move to another question about COVID. Then I want to dig a little deeper into your research and your role as a scholar and an educator, a researcher. So this other piece of the COVID question is, my gosh, not only have we experienced COVID over the past, it seems like forever, but it's really about a year and a half or so. But in that same time, you know, we also have these other parallel narratives. Racial injustice is more visible, and public. Political polarization, societal issues of a range of modes, environmental justice, and the global pandemic, right? So as the pandemic seems to be subsiding, those other issues are still going to be around us. I'm just curious to hear some of your personal reflections on this past year as they relate to those other social, cultural, political concerns as we move out of COVID. Where do you see those issues playing out in our lives?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's almost like you're looking at my calendar to see what I've been doing for the past couple of years. Where to start on this one? So for 6 years, I sat on the executive committee for the Society for Research in Music Education, which is an arm of NAFME. And for 2 years, I was chair. I just finished that assignment this past fall, this past spring. And I guess it was in the beginning of my my chairpersonship where I started to talk to the committee about the need for a social justice special research interest group, right? And this of course it came before last summer, before the unrest of last summer. But it was, in my mind, it was prompted by a couple of things. We've and I won't go into detail because it's not necessary, but there have been a couple of moments of upheaval at NAFME at the executive level that is being taken care of at this point. So issues of social, racial unrest have perpetrated themselves on this society, right? On the association, and it was a wake-up call.
But that gained some national attention.
Yes, it did. Yes,
outside of music education,
it
gained national attention.
Yes, and not the kind of attention that anybody wanted, and it was a huge shock to most of our profession. Mm-hmm. And NAFME hopped on it right away, which good, you know, to our credit, good. I was chair-elect during the time when, prompted by that, NAFME went through a self-study, right? They call it the Cook-Ross study because Cook-Ross is the organization who did the self-study. Mm-hmm. And what happened with that was I forget how long it took for them to do it, but they did it very systematically. And the Cook-Ross study gave us sort of a roadmap for where we should be heading next. We have a new social justice SHRIG, right? That the focus is on research in the area. And this past spring, during our national conference, was the first time they met. And I made sure that I was at that meeting, and it was packed. I mean, there were just a ton of, and a lot of young people, which I was very, very happy to see. So that's one thing. You know, being an old band director, right? I graduated undergraduate school in 1980, and I was a female band director. I was a novelty, and it depended on what group of folks I was with. I could either be sort of accepted and it was a non-issue, or not. Right. So I felt those pangs of marginalization myself. In fact, I was just on a call last night, panel discussion talking about this, and somebody said, why are we even still talking about this, you know, decades later? You know, we should not, this should be a non-issue, but it still is. Yeah. So there's that piece, and I've done some research in that area as well. Fast forward to the pandemic, social unrest, political upheaval, right? And then this past fall, Mackie started to have town hall meetings, NAFME town hall meetings, in which she opened it up so that regular members of the association could come and speak their mind. So I contacted Mackie and I said, you know, I'd like to pitch a way to take next steps. And so I pitched a committee that would, it's called the Music Education Profession Initiative. And the goal of this group is to understand, and there's so many tentacles to this, Steve, so bear with me, sure. To understand initially the barriers for high school students as far as whether or not they even can get through the door, you know. And we have such an ingrained system that has been there for decades and decades and decades, right? So you come and you have to have these pieces prepared, and you perform pretty much an audition / jury for these performance folks, and whether or not you pass that is the golden ticket, right? I mean, you can have good academics, you can be, you know, have great essay writing, get good SATs, ACT scores, but unless you pass that audition, you're not going to be a music educator. And, you know, my dear husband, he is a great musician. He's a bass player, guitar player, plays some keyboard as well. Mm-hmm. He doesn't read a lick, does not read one note of music, but he's an incredible musician. And we live down here in Bayou country, right, where there are Zydeco Cajun musicians who can play the heck out of a guitar, an accordion, you fiddle, you name it. Don't read. My bias here is that, you know, we're looking at a thin slice of musicianship when we're looking at readers, and there is this whole other world of great musicians who can be teaching our students. And how do we get those kids through the door? How do we get the kids who've never had a lesson in their lives? Why? Because mom and dad can't afford it, right? So that's the first thing. What are the barriers? What are the barriers to getting in? On this call I mentioned last night, there are at least 3 directors from HBCUs who were talking about the praxis exams being barriers to those kids, you know. Absolutely. And yeah, and I said, wow, I said, you know, I hadn't even thought about that, and we need your voice, right? So so we're talking about barriers to entry. Once we get into the university, then what does the curriculum do? What does it not do? And how can we shift the curriculum so that we are preparing people that look like our population? You know, one of the things that just sticks is a great sticking point with me is that, and I get very passionate when I talk about this, that the kids in school today, right, the population of white kids is below 49% right now, and the rest are everybody else. That's right. So but the music ed teaching population does not look like that. Not even close.
Nor does the music curriculum.
Right. Right. Exactly. And so how do we reconcile that? Well, the first thing is to get those kids through the door. And the second thing is, how can the curriculum, which you're spot on, how can the curriculum support the development of these teachers so that those kids can go out and teach the next generation, right? And to you know, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think our European traditions are great. I really do.
Absolutely.
But they're only one small piece. You know, that one of the jazz guys on the call last night was said, and this was, you know, everybody knows this intuitively, but it takes somebody to say it out loud. He said, you know, when you talk about Latinx music, what are you really talking about? You talk, because there's like 7 countries. You're talking about Mexican music. You're talking about Brazilian music. Like, what are we talking about? And I could see the faces on the call. People are like, you know, you're right. And even though there may be, relatively speaking, you know, small proportionally differences between those kinds of music, there's still a difference, and that discrimination needs to be made. So this committee is looking. The next step for this committee will be to, we've identified about 40 institutions where over the next year, we're going to be setting up not interviews, but sort of just Q&As with music ed faculty to talk about these issues, getting in, keeping kids in, and then supporting them once they get into the workforce. And we're hoping to uncover what lots of people who feel like they don't have a voice yet, what they feel are some of the answers. And it has a lot to do with curriculum. And you know this because of your position. You know, if and NASM has been around for a long time. If we are looking at NASM to sort of guide us, you know, the language for National Association of Schools of Music is vague enough so that we can kind of fit things into whatever category. On the other hand, it's not broad. We don't think the people in the committee don't think it's broad enough to encompass the things that we think it really ought to. And then you have to think about, well, who else wants a piece of that pie, right? So the state wants a piece because they're going to license these kids, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
The university wants a piece for the core curriculum, right? The college wants a piece. You know, you got to do conducting, you got to do keyboard, you got to do all those things. And so what's left at the end of all that is the professional sequence. And so, you know, it's going to be like pushing a boulder uphill. But you know, my perspective is if we can get the voices from a bunch of universities that license teachers, and have there be a really loud voice coming at us from the HBCUs, I think we'll have really good data then to have a discussion with other accrediting agencies saying, look, this is where we are and this is where we need to go. So I even forget your question at this point, but I know we're talking about social.
The question was, Deb, could you just share what's on your mind?
God, I'm so sorry. Well, and then there's one more thing, and I know I'll stop talking.
This is great stuff. No, it's a topic you and I could probably talk about for hours on end. Yep. And I actually hope that we have that opportunity. I mean, they don't have to be consecutive hours, but right. Certainly I would love to engage this conversation. If we are not already in that conversation with you, as you know, Penn State School of Music and our scholars here, which I'm sure we have several who are part of that conversation. Right. Make sure we're connected.
Absolutely.
I would encourage us to find ways to collaborate and to push these ideas, because one of the goals in our strategic plan is about fostering a culture of anti-racism, anti-oppression. Right. And, you know, in doing that, you have to look at, as the curriculum, we have to look at our demographics, we have to look at the barriers. There's an entire structural piece that we need to examine and reconstruct. As you were talking about the SATs or other exams, other gateways, statement stuck with me a number of years ago, maybe when I was a graduate student. There's no such thing as a test that is not culturally biased.
Right.
There's no such thing. You can't make a test that does not have cultural bias.
Exactly.
So then you have to determine what bias are you willing to live with, or actually be explicit. This is our bias.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But then the next step is not to position people to not be able to access that cultural angle, but to revise the way in which you prepare people to enter that enter that space. So we have so much to talk about as far as that goes.
Listen, Steve, I am so excited that you want to continue this conversation. I truly am. And consider me all on board.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Outstanding. Perfect. I did want to get to this, I said I had another COVID question, which is actually, that was the question that had to do with COVID. But the COVID moment, but just dig a bit deeper, let's deal with this question. I want to wrap up with a few of our shorter, quick fire questions.
Sure.
Just your, you mentioned this as part of your previous response, that your work with, over your career, well known in terms of in the band world with conducting, but also the ways in which you've championed the role of women in conducting, challenging gender stereotypes, pushing back or resisting these norms. I'd like to know a bit more about that. The questioning gender stereotypes in band directing, and how that work has made a positive impact. And then a question I love to ask is, well, what else do we have to keep doing to allow that impact to continue to take hold and dismantle and create a new space?
Right. Yeah. A big question. So I'll go back to something I said previously, and that is, why in the world are we still talking about this? And
right. Because it's still here.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that's crazy to me. I'll go back to my first few years of teaching. I taught in the southern tier of New York, and there were just as many at that time, just as many women teaching secondary band as there were men. And so it was a very comfortable situation. It was just, you just go up and, you just go and teach, although I did share, this was on one of our composer diversity talks the other day, and was a memory that just came flying back to me that I hadn't thought about in years. It was my second year of teaching, and we were it was just after a concert, and I was sharing concert with one of my colleagues. I taught in a central school, so 7 through 12. So we're doing the high school thing. There were 2 high school bands, and after my portion of the concert, I remember getting a handshake from our elementary band director. And he said, well, he kind of clasped me on the shoulder. He says, you've just restored my faith in girl conductors. Now that was supposed to be a compliment, but it was, like this backhanded thing, so it was qualified, you restore my faith in Black conductors. I mean, it's qualified. Sure is. And it is. And most, I shouldn't say most, because I don't know most women band directors, but some folks who I've had conversation with feel like I do, in that, well, I just want to be, seen for being good and for being a good educator. But similar to race, it's visible. Mm-hmm. Gender is visible, right? And it goes before us. It ends up becoming an identity that someone assigns to us, even if we think of ourselves as the conductor rather than the woman conductor or fill in the blank conductor, right? So it's something that we all have to, who have a physical thing, have to contend with, right? And that's been going on for a long, long time. Frank, and then I when I moved to Pennsylvania, that divide between the men and the women became far more evident to me. And I don't know
you
why.
Sensed it. It was palpable. I mean, you
it
sensed
was.
it.
And I think right now in the composer diversity course that I'm teaching, we are reading a brand new book called the Horizons Lean Forward, and it's about marginalized populations in instrumental music ed and in composition. But the theme that keeps running through it is that these folks who are in underrepresented populations constantly have to fight that battle, right? So people see them and make determinations before they even watch them work or sit in on their classes.
Mhm.
And part of the conversation that I'm having with my students and these panels coming in is that we need to be ourselves, and who we are needs to go before us, right? And that means, and that's not just what we look like, it's what we do. And one of our panelists actually said this the other day, and it stuck with me because it was in response to what one of the other panelists had said. This had to do with composers, but I think it translates to teachers as well, to conductors as well. And her name is Alyssa Jones. Alyssa, she's just a wonderful person. She's just high energy, wonderful singer, living in New Orleans right now, but I think she's going to be moving to Tampa in a couple of weeks. Taught for a long time up in, I think she taught in Boston. So anyway, she said, you know, because we're talking about quality, right? And so, you know, don't put me on the podium to check off a box as, okay, all right, we don't have to have a woman conductor for another 5 years because we did that in 2021, right? And she's talking from the standpoint of being a composer, and she said, in terms of quality, maybe I'm not as good as fill in the blank, but give me the chance to demonstrate that to you. Give me the chance to fail, because right now we're not even sharing the stage, you know, and that is because the argument, the faulty argument against, you know, women composers, composers of color, women conductors, conductors of color is, well, you know, we tried to find a good one, but you know, there just aren't that many. Well, it's because we're not giving folks a chance, right? So, and then the problem with that is, and it, well, boy, I'm just all over the map on this. After that, our first composer, our first panel on this course, within about 20 minutes, I got a phone call from a dear friend who is a middle school band director and has been a composer for, I don't know, 30 years or so, and had seen the advertising for the course and wanted to know how it went. And I said, oh, you went great. You know, we had great conversation. And this person said, and they were talking about their composition background, right? White man. And he said, you know, the thing I'm concerned about is if we open the doors, then my stuff won't get chosen anymore. And you know, that just gives me pause, right? And that can be transferred into any number of areas, right? If we open the doors to Native Americans, if we open the doors to women, if we open the doors to Black African Americans, right? And my point is, that pie is not, I mean, it may look finite, but if we open the doors to more and more people, the quality of the pie gets so much better.
That's it.
Yeah. You know, and I don't know, I don't know if I answered your question, but
you absolutely did. Again, that question alone, we could have hours of conversation on. You know, and the question relates to your work specifically in terms of gender stereotypes. Yeah. However, there's translation to these other identity spaces.
Right.
That is I mean, you framed it so well. And that last response that you shared, you know, about the pie, not only does it make that pie so much richer, I mean, if we're using that metaphor of pie, it makes it more flavorful.
Right.
It allows us to have different textures and different relationships among those components. That allows us to learn more about what we already had there.
Yes, exactly.
Right? We know things when we put them in conversation with one another. Right. Height is relative to the determination of, you know, measurement, distance. So, all right, that we have a multi-hour conversation just on this piece. Look,
right, exactly. And one of the things that I said this past Tuesday night at our last class was, if we don't open up in terms of gender, race, and expose our students,
yes,
it really, what it amounts to is censorship. We're giving them this when they could be this. right? So the opportunities we give to all sorts of conductors and composers and teachers, right, will translate for our students as this whole array of possibilities.
Mhm.
And if they're only seeing this, then the possibilities are only this, and these things out here don't even enter into that realm.
Last segment is essentially focused around a set of questions about Penn State. So we're going to go back to your time at Penn State when we were both here, but didn't necessarily know the other was here. A handful of questions. Just give me your response to these as we go through it.
Okay.
So this first one, I sense we've already touched on this earlier, but it's okay to repeat responses from earlier in the conversation. When you were at Penn State, who is a person of influence during your time as a graduate student?
I think the top three would have to be Keith, Joanne, and Dan, for sure. Keith Thompson, Joanne Rakowski, and Dan Yoder. They all gave me opportunities that were different and all very rich. So those, I mean, there were others too, but those three in particular, yeah.
Outstanding.
Neither one of those folks ever said no to me for anything.
Wow.
And that's putting a lot of faith in a very young person. So I was, yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, you showed them something that they saw. All right. And you answered that quickly. I mean, there was no hesitation, right?
Yeah.
Those are the people.
Those are the three. Yep. Yep.
We were to visit the creamery during your visit. What flavor would you order? And remember, you cannot mix flavors at the creamery, so you can only get one flavor.
Well, you know, it has to be peachy paterno, right? Do they still have that?
They apparently, I believe so. I haven't been to the creamery for a while.
That probably would be it for me. Yeah.
Okay, that's a valid answer.
Yeah.
Again, any answer about the creamery is the right answer.
Well, and in that same sense, I think any flavor would be appropriate too.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's it. Listen, Deb, if you could give advice to an incoming first-year student, either first year as an undergrad or first year as a graduate student, what piece of advice would you give them?
I would give them two, probably. Ask questions is the first one. There's so much that we don't know as graduate students and as undergraduate students. And Penn State in particular, because it's so stinking big, right? That it's so welcoming, at least it was when I was there, right? So ask questions of your friends, of strangers, of your faculty. Don't try to go it alone, because that's not, you know, the university experience has to be, there's got to be that social piece. That social piece also helps to drive our success, I think. So ask lots of questions. And I think the other thing would be to do as much as possible, experience as much as possible. You know, your classes are one thing, and of course classes get us to a goal, right, the degree. Mm-hmm. But you know, being full-time or even part-time at a university has great privilege, and it's gone in a blink. You know, you mentioned Malcolm
Gladwell.
Mm-hmm. Gladwell, thank you. And mm-hmm. It reminds me of his book Blink. It's gone in an instant. And you know, I always thought of my time in my advanced degrees in particular as real privilege. You know, it was a very selfish time in my life because I was focusing on me, you know, but in a good way. And so if it's very finite, and just grab as much as possible. Yeah, you go to recitals and you do your concerts and things, but you know, go to basketball games and hockey games and football games, and walk the campus and take a course that doesn't have anything to do with music. You know, go across campus and take a course in, I don't know, geology or something. You know, get to know other areas of the campus. Walk into buildings, get to know, you know, the physical spaces. I remember, you know, this, you know what, darn it, I should have said this too. I loved, and we don't do this anymore, unfortunately, I used to love hanging out in the library when I was there. I mean, the stacks to me were magical. They were just magical. And, you know, we don't have as, I don't know, having the internet is cool because there's a lot we can see more quickly, but walking in the library and physically handling a book that might be 70, 80 years old, wow. I mean, that I don't know. I just think that's got to be part of the process as well. Get into town, be part of the community, not just the person who rents the community for a short period of time, but be part of that community. Try to give back in some way because it is a selfish point in time. So if we can give back in some way, you become part of the community that the community wants, who the community wants to return, and not just somebody who kind of blows in and blows out.
Yeah.
And if I had to do it all over again, I would actually take some of my own advice. There a lot of this, some of those things I didn't do. So I think that's what I would say to kids coming in now.
Nice. Those are that great. Those are great pieces of advice. And actually, I typically follow up that question by asking if you would have followed that advice when you were a student. It sounds like you would have at least listened, right?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. I think I would have. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
But yeah, especially I think especially if uh you have a connection with some friends and faculty who you can really be honest with,
Mhm.
if somebody of authority is giving you that advice, then I think kids are more students are more apt to listen, which means that the onus then is on faculty members to really, figure out what those students need and be there for them. So it's kind of cuts both ways.
That's right. And as
Yeah.
we opened, seems to me there were two people who gave you some pretty key advice, and you listened to it. So thank you,
That's right.
Keith, and thank you, Joanne.
Amen to that.
Yeah,
Amen. Yeah.
Deb, this has been a pleasure
For me too, Steve.
talking with you, chatting with you. This first conversation of what I hope are many more to come.
Me too.
Thanks again. Look forward to seeing you here.
I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to it too. We'll talk more about the logistics in a while. Okay.
Sounds great. You got
All
it.
right. Great. Thank you.